Have you ever witnessed a moment so powerful it changed everyone in the room? A moment where every assumption you held shattered in an instant. What would you do if you discovered you'd mocked someone whose talent surpassed anything you'd ever seen? This is the story of one Tuesday night at a small bar in Chicago. A night that taught an entire room what true mastery looks like. A night when a forgotten man reminded everyone that dignity and brilliance can live in the most unexpected places. The worn piano keys gleamed under the dim bar lights as weathered fingers moved across them with impossible grace. Liszt's La Campanella filled every corner of the rusty anchor, each note cascading like liquid silver. The technically demanding piece, known for breaking even accomplished pianists, flowed from the hands of a man in a tattered military jacket. A man who just hours earlier had been dismissed as nothing more than a charity case. The bar stood frozen. Not a glass clinked. Not a voice whispered. Every eye fixed on the figure at the piano on fingers that danced across ivory keys, with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a poet. And there near the back stood a young man named Brandon. 22 years old, Northwestern University senior, son of privilege. Tears streamed down his face, the same face that 3 hours earlier had twisted into a cruel smirk. The same mouth that had mocked and jeered now hung open in disbelief. How did we get here? How did a homeless veteran in clothes that hung loose on his thin frame become the center of this unforgettable moment? Why was the young man who had ridiculed him now standing with his hands clasped, body trembling, tears falling freely? And what could possibly have happened to transform an ordinary Tuesday night into something no one in that bar would ever forget? To understand that we need to go back. Back to 3 hours earlier, when the evening was just beginning. Back to before anyone knew the truth. Back to when a forgotten man walked through a door seeking something he'd lost 30 years ago. 3 hours earlier, the Rusty Anchor was just another neighborhood bar on the south side of Chicago. It wasn't fancy. The wooden floors had seen better days, scarred by decades of shuffling feet. The bar top, though polished, bore the circular stains of 1,000 beer glasses. Neon signs advertising various brands of beer flickered in the windows, casting colored shadows across the worn booths. But on Tuesday nights, the Rusty Anchor became something special. Every Tuesday at 7, Marie, the 50-something bartender with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail, hosted an open mic night. Anyone could sign up. Anyone could perform. Singers, poets, guitarists, storytellers. All were welcome. It was Marie's rule, and she enforced it with the authority of someone who'd been pouring drinks in this neighborhood for 25 years. The regulars loved it. It brought the community together, gave people a platform, a voice, a moment in the spotlight, however brief. Tonight, about 30 people filled the bar. Some sat at tables nursing beers and waiting their turn. Others clustered near the small stage area, a cleared corner with a microphone stand, and pushed against the wall an old upright piano. The piano had been there longer than Marie had been bartending. Its wood was scratched, some keys slightly yellowed, but it still held a tune. Mostly it went unused, except for the occasional brave soul who'd had a few too many and decided to plink out chopsticks. At exactly 6:45, the door opened and Terrence Walker stepped inside. He paused just past the threshold, as if gathering courage. 67 years old African-American, with skin weathered by years of exposure to elements. His hair, once black, had turned completely silver and gray, uncombed and slightly matted. A beard, equally gray, covered his jaw, unkempt and wild. He wore an old military jacket, the kind issued to army personnel decades ago, but it hung on his frame tattered and stained. Beneath it, layers of worn clothing. On his feet, boots that had walked too many miles, the leather cracked and splitting. This was a man that Chicago's streets had claimed. A man who carried everything he owned in a small backpack slung over one shoulder. The conversations near the door died first, then spread like ripples across the bar. Heads turned. Some faces showed pity, others discomfort. A few people deliberately looked away, not wanting to make eye contact. It was the universal response to seeing homelessness. The desire to help, mixed with the helplessness of not knowing, how often resolving into simply pretending not to see. But Terrence wasn't looking at them. His eyes, a deep brown that might once have sparkled with youth, now held something harder. Something that had seen too much. Those eyes scanned the room and found what they were seeking, the piano. His gaze locked onto it like a drowning man spotting land. For just a moment, something flickered across his weathered face. Not quite hope, not quite longing. Something deeper. Something that suggested this instrument represented more than just wood and wire and ivory keys. He moved slowly toward an empty corner booth, as far from other patrons as possible. Sat down carefully, as if his joints ached. Removed his backpack. Set it beside him. And then he simply watched the piano, his calloused hands resting on the table fingers, occasionally twitching, as though remembering something from long ago. Marie from behind the bar noticed him. She'd been tending bar long enough to recognize the look of a veteran. Something about the way they carried themselves, even broken ones. She filled a glass with water, walked over, and set it down in front of him, without a word. Just a small nod. A gesture that said, "You're welcome here." Terrence looked up at her, surprised, nodded back. Whispered, "Thank you." His voice was rough from disuse, but there was a dignity in it. Marie smiled and returned to the bar. Not everyone shared her grace. At 7 o'clock, a group of 4 young men burst through the door in a wave of laughter and expensive cologne. They were college-aged early 20s, wearing the kind of casual clothing that costs more than it looks. Designer jeans, brand-name hoodies, spotless sneakers that probably cost $300 a pair. Leading them was Brandon Mitchell. Tall blonde, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. It was his 22nd birthday, and his friends, Connor, Dylan, and Trevor, had insisted on celebrating at every bar between campus and downtown. The Rusty Anchor was stop number 4. They were well on their way to drunk. Brandon's father owned a chain of car dealerships across the Midwest. Connor's family were lawyers. Dylan came from old money, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. Trevor's parents were both surgeons. These were young men who'd been told all their lives they were special, destined for greatness. Better than. They grabbed a table near the center of the room, loud and oblivious to the annoyed glances from regulars who knew this was a performance night, not a fraternity party. It took Brandon maybe 3 minutes to notice Terrence. He elbowed Connor, nodded toward the corner booth. "Check out the local color," he said, not quite whispering, loud enough for several tables to hear. Connor glanced over, smirked. "Bet he's waiting for someone to buy him a drink." Dylan, slightly less drunk than the others, looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Trevor, always eager to impress Brandon, added, "Should we take bets on how long before he asks for spare change?" Laughter rippled through their table. A few heads turned disapproving. but no one said anything. It was easier not to. Marie, however, caught it, shot them a warning look from behind the bar. Brandon, noticing, raised his beer in mock salute, his grin widening. At exactly 7:15, Marie stepped up to the microphone. "All right, everyone. Welcome to Open Mic Tuesday, here at the Rusty Anchor. You know the rules. Everyone who wants to perform gets 5 minutes. Sign-up sheet is here at the bar. Let's hear it for our first performer, Angela Martinez." A young woman with a guitar took the stage. She sang a cover of a folk song, pretty voice, a little shaky with nerves. Polite applause followed. Then came Marcus, a regular, who did a spoken word piece about growing up in the neighborhood. More applause. Then Janet, older woman, sang a jazz standard. The evening rolled forward pleasant and unremarkable. Terrence sat in his corner watching each performer, but his eyes kept returning to the piano. His fingers continued their slight, unconscious movements on the table. Muscle memory, perhaps, or something deeper. Brandon and his friends grew louder with each drink. Comments about the performers. Jokes at their expense. Marie warned them twice. They'd quiet down for a few minutes, then start up again. At 7:50, there was a lull. Marie checked her sign-up sheet. "All right, anyone else? Don't be shy. This is a judgment-free zone," she said the last part while staring pointedly at Brandon's table. That's when Terrence stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He rose from the booth, leaving his backpack behind. Every eye in the bar tracked him as he walked toward Marie at the bar. Up close, the wear on him was even more apparent. The lines carved deep into his face, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his clothes hung on what was clearly an underfed frame. But he stood straight, military bearing despite everything. "Ma'am," he said quietly to Marie, "I'd like to play the piano, if that's all right." His voice, though rough, carried a formality, a politeness from another era. Marie's face softened. "Of course, honey. What's your name, Terrence? Terrence Walker. Well, Terrence, you just made my night. It's been months since anyone touched that piano. You're up next." From across the room, Brandon had heard the exchange. He leaned toward his friends. "Oh, this is going to be good." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "The charity case is going to play piano." Connor snorted. Does he even know which end of the piano to sit at? Dylan, still uncomfortable, said, "Come on, guys. Maybe he can actually play." Trevor laughed. "Yeah, and maybe I'm going to wake up as Elon Musk tomorrow." Their laughter carried. Several people at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably. An older man at the bar turned and said, "Show some respect." Brandon, emboldened by alcohol, shot back. "For what?" "Looking homeless." "That's not an accomplishment, old man." The tension in the bar ratcheted up several notches. Marie set down the glass she was cleaning with more force than necessary. "Brandon Mitchell, one more word and you're out. I don't care whose birthday it is." Brandon held up his hands in mock surrender. Fine, I'll just watch the show." But his smirk didn't fade. Marie stepped back to the microphone. Her voice was firm, protective. "Our next performer is Terrence Walker. Let's give him a warm, Rusty Anchor welcome." Scattered applause. Polite. A little uncertain. A few people clapped more enthusiastically, the regulars who respected Marie's judgment. Terrence walked toward the piano. Each step seemed to cost him something. Not physically. He wasn't limping or weak, but emotionally. As if every foot closer to that instrument brought back memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. The piano sat against the wall, slightly battered but dignified in its wear. The bench in front of it had seen better days, the padding worn thin wood scratched. Terrence stood before it for a moment, just looking. His weathered hands hung at his sides, trembling slightly. Behind him, Brandon stage whispered to his table. "Bet you $10 he plays chopsticks." Connor: "You're on. I bet he doesn't even know where middle C is." Trevor: "My money's on him just sitting there staring at it like he's doing now." More laughter. Dylan looked down at his beer, unable to watch. A woman at a nearby table said, "Have some decency." Brandon turned to her. "What, I'm just making conversation. It's a free country, isn't it?" His tone was mocking, challenging. The woman shook her head in disgust and turned away. Marie from the bar called out, "Whenever you're ready, Terrence." Terrence nodded. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself onto the bench. The slight creak of old wood filled a room that had gone quiet, waiting. He adjusted his position, sliding slightly to the left, then the right. Finding the center. The movement was practiced. Automatic. Muscle memory from a lifetime ago. His hands rose and hovered over the keys. They hung there for several long seconds. Weathered, scarred, calloused from years of rough living. Fingernails short and uneven. These were not the hands of a pianist. These were hands that had known hardship, labor, survival. Brandon couldn't resist. Is he praying? Someone tell him it's a piano, not a church. A few nervous laughs. But most people had stopped paying attention to Brandon. Something about the moment held them. The way Terrence sat, the way his hands hovered, the absolute stillness of his posture. And then his eyes closed. The bar held its breath. Terrence's right index finger descended and touched a single key. Middle C. The note rang out pure and clear in the silence. It sustained hanging in the air and then faded. Then his left hand joined, a low bass note, then another. Then his right hand moved, finding a chord. Then another note. And another. The opening measures of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata third movement began to fill the rusty anchor. The transformation was instantaneous. Brandon's smirk vanished. Connor's mouth fell open. Trevor's hand, lifting a beer to his lips, froze midway. Dylan looked up, eyes wide. Because what was coming from that old piano wasn't the hesitant plinking of an amateur. It wasn't even the competent playing of someone who'd had lessons as a child. This was something else entirely. Terrence's fingers moved across the keys with fluid precision. The Moonlight Sonata isn't an easy piece. The third movement is technically demanding, requiring rapid arpeggios, precise fingerwork, and emotional depth. It's a piece that separates those who play piano from those who are pianists. And Terrence Walker was playing it flawlessly. His weathered hands, which had looked so broken and uncertain moments ago, now moved with the confidence of a master. They flowed across the keys like water over stone. Every note was perfect. Every phrase shaped with intention. The dynamics shifted from whisper-soft to powerful, without ever becoming harsh. The melody was melancholic and haunting, exactly as Beethoven had intended. But there was something else in it, too. Something that spoke of loss, of longing, of a man who had once been something else, something more. The bar had gone completely silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses were set down quietly. Even the kitchen staff, hearing the music, had emerged to stand in the doorway listening. Marie stood behind the bar with one hand pressed to her chest, tears already forming in her eyes. She'd run this open mic for 6 years. She'd heard good performers and bad. But this was something she'd never expected to hear in her bar. This was concert hall quality. This was virtuoso-level playing. At Brandon's table, the 4 young men sat frozen. The alcohol haze seemed to evaporate in the face of what they were hearing. Brandon's face had gone pale. The arrogance had drained away, replaced by confusion, by disbelief, and beginning to creep in at the edges by shame, because he was starting to understand what everyone else in the bar was realizing. They weren't listening to a homeless man play piano. They were listening to a master, a true artist, someone whose fingers held decades of training, of practice, of dedication to a craft. Terrence's eyes remained closed. His body swayed slightly with the music, feeling it as much as playing it. His face, weathered and worn, had smoothed. The years seemed to fall away. For these moments, he wasn't a broken man living on the streets. He was something transcendent. He was the music itself, the piece built in intensity. Beethoven had written it to storm, to rage, to demand. And Terrence gave it everything. His hands moved faster, the notes cascading in brilliant runs. His left hand provided the thundering foundation while his right danced above, intricate and perfect. People in the bar began to lean forward in their seats. Some stood moving closer, drawn by the magnetism of true artistry. A few had phones out recording, but most simply listened, transfixed. Brandon's hands had begun to shake. He gripped his beer bottle tightly, as if it could anchor him against the realization washing over him. Connor had tears in his eyes, though he seemed not to notice. Dylan had his head bowed, unable to look at the piano, overwhelmed. Trevor simply stared, his face a mask of shock. The Moonlight Sonata built toward its conclusion. The final section demanded everything a pianist had: speed, power, precision, emotion. Lesser players stumbled here. Even good pianists showed strain. Terrence's face remained serene. His hands never faltered. The music poured from him like a river that had finally found its path to the sea after years of being dammed. And then the final chord, powerful, definitive, perfect. It rang through the bar, sustaining, slowly fading into silence. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. And then from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Then another. Then another. Within moments, the entire bar erupted in applause. People stood whistling, cheering. It wasn't polite applause. It was the kind of thunderous appreciation usually reserved for concert halls, for professionals, for masters of their craft. But Terrence didn't acknowledge it. He didn't stand, didn't turn, didn't even open his eyes. Because he wasn't finished. His hands, still resting on the keys, shifted position. The applause began to quiet as people realized he was going to play another piece. The room settled back into attention, hungry for more. And Terrence began Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. If the Moonlight Sonata had been impressive, this was transcendent. The ballad is one of Chopin's most complex and emotionally demanding pieces. It begins quietly, almost questioningly. A simple melody that grows and transforms. It requires not just technical skill, but deep musical understanding. The ability to tell a story through sound. Terrence told that story. His hands moved with even greater confidence, now warmed up remembering. The ballade started gently, almost conversationally. A question posed in music. And then it built. Layer upon layer of complexity. Melodies interweaving. Harmonies that made the heart ache. This was music that spoke of tragedy and triumph, of love and loss, of hope despite despair. Every person listening heard their own story in it, their own struggles, their own moments of beauty amid the pain. At Brandon's table, Connor had put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook. Dylan stared at Terrence with an expression of wonder and crushing guilt. Trevor looked sick, his face greenish, whether from alcohol or shame was impossible to tell. And Brandon. Brandon sat perfectly still, tears streaming silently down his face. Every cruel word he'd spoken in the last hour played back in his mind, every mocking laugh, every contemptuous glance. All of it aimed at a man who possessed more talent and artistry than Brandon would likely ever achieve in anything. The ballade moved through its various sections. Choppy, stormy moments gave way to passages of breathtaking beauty. Terrence navigated them all with the ease of someone who'd lived with this music for a lifetime. Because he had. This wasn't a piece he'd learned recently. This was something carved into his muscle memory decades ago. Something his fingers knew as well as they knew how to tie shoes or button a shirt. Marie behind the bar made no attempt to hide her tears. They flowed freely down her face as she listened. Several other patrons were similarly moved. An elderly woman in a corner booth wept openly. A middle-aged man near the stage had his eyes closed, swaying slightly lost in the music. The ballade built toward its famous coda. The final section is notoriously difficult, a test of stamina and technical prowess. Rapid octaves in the left hand, brilliant cascading runs in the right. It should sound powerful, but never harsh, triumphant, but tinged with the tragedy that came before. Terrence played it with a fire that suggested he was pouring every ounce of his being into these final measures. His body rocked slightly with the motion. His face, still largely peaceful, showed subtle expressions. A slight furrowing of the brow during a particularly emotional phrase. The ghost of a smile during a moment of beauty. And then the final chord progression. Falling, descending, resolved. G minor to G major, from darkness to light. The transformation complete. The last chord hung in the air, sustaining through the natural resonance of the piano. Slowly, slowly fading. Silence, deeper than before. Because everyone in the rusty anchor understood they'd just witnessed something extraordinary, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A moment of pure, undiluted artistry in the most unexpected of places, from the most unexpected of sources. But the question remained. The question that had formed in everyone's mind the moment Terrence had played that first perfect note. Who was this man? Where had he learned to play like this? And what had happened to bring someone with such profound gifts to this point, sitting alone in a corner of a neighborhood bar, homeless and forgotten? The answer to those questions lay 30 years in the past. In a story of dreams and war and trauma and loss. A story that if they'd known, it would have made everything even more heartbreaking, even more profound. But Terrence wasn't ready to share that story. Not yet. Not with words. So instead, his hands shifted position one more time on the keys, and he began to play again. The third piece Terrence chose was no accident. Where Beethoven had been powerful and Chopin had been emotional, this next piece would be pure technical display, a showcase of virtuosity that left no doubt about the level of his training. Franz Liszt's La Campanella. The opening notes tinkled out like a music box, delicate and precise. Anyone with even a passing knowledge of classical piano knew this piece. knew its reputation. It's considered one of the most difficult pieces in the standard repertoire. Written by Liszt himself, one of the greatest pianists who ever lived, as a demonstration of technical wizardry. The piece requires enormous leaps across the keyboard, rapid repeated notes, brilliant runs, octave work, trills. Everything that makes piano difficult, all packed into roughly 6 minutes of music. Professional pianists practice for years to master it. Many never attempt it at all. Terrence Walker. Homeless, 67 years old, in a tattered military jacket, played it as if it were second nature. His fingers flew. The music danced and sparkled, living up to its nickname, the Little Bell. Each note was clear and precise, no matter how fast the tempo. His right hand jumped across 2 octaves in a single motion, landed perfectly executed. A rapid trill jumped again. His left hand provided the supportive harmonies, leaping between bass notes and chords with unerring accuracy. This wasn't just playing. This was control, mastery, the kind that comes from 10,000 hours of dedicated practice, from a lifetime devoted to an instrument. The people of the Rusty Anchor were beyond shock now. They'd moved into something like awe. Some stood, others remained seated, but all were completely absorbed. This was the kind of performance you told people about, the kind you remembered decades later, the kind that in a different venue would have commanded ticket prices in the hundreds of dollars. And they were witnessing it in a South Side neighborhood bar, played by a man most of them had pitied or ignored when he walked in. At Brandon's table, the young man had his elbows on the table, his head in his hands, staring at Terrence through his fingers. The tears hadn't stopped. His friends sat around him in various states of emotional devastation. The confidence, the arrogance, the casual cruelty they'd displayed earlier had been completely stripped away, leaving only raw shame and regret. But even as the music filled the bar, even as everyone listened in wonder, the central question burned brighter. Who was Terrence Walker? Marie thought she might know. She'd seen the bearing, the way he'd approached the piano with reverence despite his condition, the formality of his speech. And that military jacket, old as it was, suggested service. She'd worked with enough veteran outreach programs to recognize the signs. PTSD, trauma, the particular kind of brokenness that came from seeing things no person should have to see. But the piano playing that suggested conservatory training, years of study, the kind of education that cost enormous amounts of money and required incredible dedication. Those two worlds seemed impossible to reconcile. How did a classically trained pianist end up homeless and forgotten? The answer, as it often is, was both simpler and more tragic than anyone could have guessed. Terrence Walker had been born in Chicago in 1957 to working-class parents. His father worked in a factory. His mother cleaned houses. They lived in a small apartment on the South Side, the same neighborhood where the Rusty Anchor now stood. Money was always tight. Luxuries were rare. But when Terrence was 7, his elementary school teacher noticed something. During music class, while other children banged randomly on instruments, Terrence seemed to understand it. He could hear a melody and reproduce it, could identify notes by ear. Natural pitch, natural rhythm, natural musicality. The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, made a phone call to a friend who taught piano. "I've got a student you need to meet," she'd said. 2 weeks later, Terrence Walker sat at a piano for the first time. The teacher, Mr. Christopher Yates, a black pianist who'd studied at the New England Conservatory, played a simple C major scale. "Try that," he said. Terrence tried. Got it on the second attempt. Mr. Yates played a simple melody. Terrence reproduced it. Mr. Yates played a more complex melody. Terrence reproduced it, only making 2 mistakes. "How often can you bring him?" Mr. Yates asked Terrence's mother. "We can't afford lessons," she'd said quietly. "I'm not charging," Mr. Yates replied. "This child is gifted. I'm not letting that go to waste." And so began 13 years of study. Terrence went to Mr. Yates's house every Tuesday and Thursday after school, practiced on an old upright piano that Mr. Yates kept specifically for students who couldn't afford their own. Mr. Yates taught him everything: technique, theory, history, repertoire. By the time Terrence was 14, he was playing Rachmaninoff. By 16, he'd won several regional competitions. By 18, he'd been accepted to the Juilliard School in New York City, one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the world. Full scholarship. His parents cried when he got the acceptance letter. Mr. Yates took him out for the first steak dinner of his life. Mrs. Henderson, his elementary school teacher, sent a card that said, "I knew you were special. Go show the world." September 1980. Terrence Walker, 23 years old, started at Juilliard. He was one of only a handful of black students in the piano program. Some professors had subtle biases. Some students were less than welcoming. But Terrence had dealt with prejudice all his life. He knew how to handle it. Let the music speak. Let the talent be undeniable. And it was. Within his first semester, professors were calling him one of the most naturally gifted pianists they'd taught. His technique was flawless, his musicality profound, his work ethic unmatched. He practiced 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, fell asleep dreaming of fingerings and dynamics and phrasing. He had friends, a small circle of other dedicated musicians. They'd practice together, encourage each other, occasionally venture out into the city for cheap pizza and cheaper beer. And he met Claire Hartman. She was a violinist, 3 years older than him, from Connecticut, blonde, tall, with a laugh that made everyone around her smile. She heard him practicing one day, knocked on the practice room door, and said, "Whoever's playing Chopin in there is making me cry. Want to get coffee?" They dated for a year. She understood the demands of being a musician. The long hours, the obsessive focus, the emotional highs and lows. She didn't just accept it. She lived it herself. In October 1981, they'd just started talking about moving in together, about the future, about eventually getting married, though they were both young, and money was tight, and careers needed building first. That's when the letter arrived. A draft notice. Selective service. The United States, still registering all young men for potential military service, had decided it needed Terrence Walker more than Juilliard did. This was 1981. The Vietnam War had ended, but the Cold War still raged. The draft had technically ended in 1973, but registration remained mandatory. And occasionally in peacetime, men were still called up for service. Terrence Walker was one of them. He tried to get a deferment, explained that he was at Juilliard, that he was on scholarship, that his future was music, not military. The appeals went nowhere. The decision was final. Report for basic training, January 1982. He had 3 months. Claire cried when he told her. "We'll figure it out," she said. "You'll serve your time and come back. Your spot will be here. We'll be here." Mr. Yates. When Terrence called him with the news, was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "The world is not fair, Terrence. But you're strong. You'll survive this. And when you come back, you'll play again." December 1981. Terrence gave a farewell recital at Juilliard. played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the student orchestra. Claire sat in the front row crying through the whole performance. His parents flew out from Chicago, first time they'd been on a plane. Mr. Yates was there too. Standing ovation at the end. 20 minutes of applause. Professor Anderson, head of the piano department, told him, "You have a gift, Mr. Walker. Don't let the Army take that from you. Find a piano wherever you're stationed. Practice. Stay sharp. You will come back to us." Terrence believed him. Believed he'd be back in a couple of years. That this was just a detour. An unfortunate interruption. But not the end. He was wrong. January 1982. Fort Benning, Georgia. Basic training. Terrence Walker, classical pianist, learned how to shoot an M16, how to march in formation, how to follow orders without question. He hated every second of it. The yelling, the physical demands, the utter lack of music. But he survived it. Got assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. Infantry. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Figured he'd spend 2 years there, maybe get deployed somewhere peaceful. Serve his time, go home. October 1983. Operation Urgent Fury. The United States invaded Grenada. Terrence's unit was deployed. He was 26 years old, had never been in combat, had spent his life around piano keys and music scores, not rifles and combat zones. The invasion was brief, a few days, but those days were enough. Terrence saw combat, saw people die. Killed, maybe. He was never sure. In the chaos, in the noise, in the fear, he fired his weapon. Others fell. Were they his? He didn't know. Couldn't know. He came back different. Nightmares started. Jumpiness. Couldn't sleep without seeing the faces. Couldn't close his eyes without hearing the sounds. But he finished his service. Got honorably discharged in 1985. Came back to New York. Claire was still there. Still waiting. Older. Worried. She held him when he showed up at her door and said, "I'm back." Juilliard welcomed him back, reinstated his scholarship. He sat down at a piano for the first time in 3 years. His hands shook. The notes came out wrong. His technique, which had been flawless, was rusty. Worse than rusty. He couldn't focus, couldn't remember fingerings, couldn't sit still long enough to practice for more than 20 minutes before the anxiety became overwhelming. PTSD. Though in 1985 they didn't call it that as much. Didn't treat it as well. Didn't understand it as fully. Terrence was told to tough it out, to get over it, that it was just stress and would pass. It didn't pass. He tried for a year. Claire tried to help. Professor Anderson tried to help. They got him into therapy. It helped a little, but not enough. The trauma was too deep, the memories too vivid. Every loud noise sent him into panic. Every crowd made him anxious. And the piano, which had once been his sanctuary, now felt like a prison, a reminder of what he'd lost, what he could no longer be. In December 1986, Terrence dropped out of Juilliard. Claire tried to make it work, tried to support him, but Terrence was spiraling, drinking too much, isolating, angry at himself, angry at the world, angry at the unfairness of it all. In March 1987, Claire left. She didn't want to. She still loved him. But she couldn't watch him destroy himself. Couldn't be dragged down with him. Terrence understood. Told her she was right to go. Didn't fight it. He moved back to Chicago, back to the South Side. Got a job at a warehouse. Hated it. Quit. Got another job. Hated it too. Quit. Tried to stay with his parents. But the nightmares were bad. He'd wake up screaming. They didn't know how to help. Neither did he. He started drinking more. Stopped showing up for work, lost jobs. couldn't hold anything down. The PTSD was untreated. The depression deepened. His parents tried everything they could, but Terrence pushed them away, told them he was fine, that he just needed space. In 1989, his mother died. Heart attack. Terrence was too drunk at the time to make it to the hospital before she passed. The guilt nearly destroyed him. His father tried to help after that, but Terrence wouldn't let him. Disappeared for weeks at a time. Would show up, borrow money, disappear again. In 1991, his father passed away. Cancer. Terrence was at the funeral. Sober for once. Cried harder than he'd ever cried in his life. There was no one left. Mr. Yates had died in 1988. Heart attack. Terrence hadn't gone to the funeral. His friends from Juilliard had moved on. Careers, families, lives. He'd lost touch. Claire had married someone else, a violinist from the Boston Symphony. Terrence saw the announcement in a music magazine once, threw it in the trash, was happy for her. Genuinely. She deserved happiness. He had nothing. By 1995, Terrence Walker was living on the streets. Odd jobs when he could get them. Shelters when the weather was bad. Handouts from kind strangers. Years blurred together. The city changed around him. He became part of the landscape, another homeless veteran, invisible. And through all of it, he avoided pianos. Couldn't stand to see them. Couldn't bear the reminder of what he'd lost, what he'd almost been, until tonight. Tonight, walking past the rusty anchor, he'd heard music through the door, someone singing, and something in him broke open, or maybe broke closed. He couldn't tell, but he found himself walking in, sitting down, looking at that old upright piano. And for the first time in 30 years, he thought, maybe. Just once, just to see if it's still there. So he'd signed up, sat through the mockery, the cruel comments, let it wash over him because he'd survived worse. So much worse. And when he sat down at that piano, and his hands hovered over the keys, he'd whispered a silent prayer. To Mr. Yates, to his mother, to his father, to Claire, to everyone he'd lost. Please let me remember, just for tonight. Let me remember who I was. And when his fingers touched the keys, they did remember. The muscle memory was still there, buried under decades of trauma and neglect. The training, the thousands of hours of practice, the love of music. All still there. Waiting. As Terrence's fingers danced through La Campanella's intricate passages, the music carried him backward through time. Each note unlocked another memory, another moment from the life he'd lived before. He remembered the first time Mr. Yates had played this piece for him. Terrence must have been 16. Mr. Yates, already old, then his fingers not as nimble as they once were, had played the opening measures and then stopped. This is what you'll play someday, Terrence, when you're ready, when you've put in the work. This is the mountain you'll climb. Terrence had laughed, amazed that human fingers could move that fast. I'll never be able to do that, he'd said. Mr. Yates had smiled. Not today, but someday. I promise you. 5 years later, at Juilliard, Terrence had mastered it, played it for his junior recital. The audience had erupted. Professor Anderson had said afterward, Christopher Yates was right about you. He told me once you were the most gifted student he'd ever taught. He was right. That memory faded, replaced by another. Claire's apartment. Late night. Both of them exhausted from practicing all day. She was learning a Brahms violin sonata. He was working on Rachmaninoff. They'd ordered Chinese takeout, couldn't afford much else. Sat on her floor, eating from containers, talking about the future. Where do you want to end up? She'd asked. Symphony Hall. Maybe Chicago. Or New York. Boston would be good too. Anywhere I can play. What about teaching? Maybe. After I've performed for a while. I want kids to have what I had. Someone who believed in them. You'll be a great teacher. You think so, I know so. You have patience. And you understand what it's like to struggle. Not everyone at Juilliard does. He'd kissed her then. Thought about proposing. Didn't because he had no money for a ring and it seemed too soon. Figured he had time. He'd been wrong about that too. Another memory. Fort Bragg. After Grenada. After the nightmares started. He'd found a chapel on base that had an old piano. Nothing fancy. Half the keys stuck. Out of tune. But it was a piano. He'd tried to play. Sat down, hands on the keys, started Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, one of his favorites. Got through 3 measures before the shaking started. His hands wouldn't stay steady. The notes came out sloppy wrong. He'd tried again. Same result. Tried a 3rd time. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even find the right keys. He'd stood up, walked out, and never touched a piano again, until 30 years later in a Chicago bar when something in him decided to try one more time. La Campanella built toward its climax. The technical demands increased. Octave runs, brilliant cascading passages, jumps across 2.5 octaves, repeated precise, perfect. Terrence's hands flew. Muscle memory. All those hours with Mr. Yates. All those years at Juilliard. All that training. It had never left. It had just been buried, waiting for the moment when he was ready to remember. The people of the Rusty Anchor could hear it in the music, could feel it. This wasn't just technical skill. This was a man reclaiming something he'd lost. Every note was an act of defiance against the trauma that had stolen his life. Every phrase was a declaration: I was someone. I am someone. I still have this. Marie behind the bar understood it perhaps better than anyone. She'd worked with enough veterans to recognize the signs. The PTSD, the way Terrence had flinched slightly when Brandon had raised his voice, the careful, controlled movements, the isolation. She'd seen men like Terrence before, broken by service, cast aside by a system that didn't know how to help them. She'd volunteered at VA hospitals, served meals at veteran shelters. She knew the statistics, knew how many ended up homeless, how many self-medicated with alcohol or drugs, how many simply gave up. But she'd never seen one play piano like this. At Brandon's table, something fundamental had shifted. The young man sat perfectly still now, his earlier swagger completely gone. He watched Terrence with an expression that mixed wonder, shame, and something approaching reverence. Brandon had grown up with every advantage: money, education, opportunity. He'd been told all his life he was special, that he was going to do great things. He'd believed it too. Walked through the world with the confidence of someone who'd never really struggled, never really failed, never really faced consequences. And in less than an hour, a homeless man he'd mocked had revealed a depth of talent and dedication that Brandon couldn't begin to comprehend. Had survived hardships Brandon couldn't imagine. Had lost more than Brandon had ever possessed. It was humbling. No, more than humbling. It was devastating. Connor sitting next to him wasn't in much better shape. His eyes were red from crying. He'd always followed Brandon's lead, been the sidekick, the yes man. If Brandon mocked someone, Connor mocked them too. Seemed harmless. Just jokes. Just having fun. Except it wasn't harmless. It never had been. And sitting here listening to this music, understanding that the man playing it had overheard every cruel word they'd said, made Connor feel sick to his stomach. Dylan had his phone out recording. But not for social media. Not to show off. He was recording because he understood that this was something important, something he'd want to remember. Proof that moments of grace and beauty could happen anywhere, that talent and dignity existed in unexpected places, that his assumptions about the world had been fundamentally wrong. Trevor had his head down on the table. Whether he'd passed out from alcohol or was simply overwhelmed was unclear, but even he, in his limited state, had stopped laughing. The piece moved into its final section. La Campanella's ending is as demanding as its beginning. Rapid, repeated notes, octaves, a final trill, and then the last chord. Bright, triumphant, resolving in a major key despite all the complexity that had come before. Terrence played those final measures with everything he had, his entire body engaged, rocking slightly with the motion, face peaceful despite the physical demands, hands moving faster than seemed possible, yet every note clear and precise, and then the final chord, both hands, fortissimo, triumphant, perfect. The note sustained, rang through the bar, slowly, slowly faded. Silence. Again. Deeper than before, if that were possible. 5 full seconds. Then someone in the back stood up, started clapping. Then another. Then another. Within moments, every single person in the Rusty Anchor was on their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting, whistling. Some were crying openly, others laughed with joy. All of them united in the recognition that they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. The applause went on for a full minute. Terrence, still seated at the piano, his hands resting on the keys, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it, just sat there, head bowed, breathing deeply. Because for him, this wasn't about applause, wasn't about recognition. This was about proving to himself that it was still there, that all those years of work hadn't been wasted, that he could still do the one thing that had once defined him. And he could. He had. The music had come back. Slowly, Terrence stood. The applause continued. He turned to face the room, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked at the people. Really looked at them. Faces full of joy, of appreciation, of respect. No pity now. No discomfort. Just genuine admiration. His eyes swept across the room and landed on Marie. She was crying, smiling, clapping hard enough that her hands must have hurt. When their eyes met, she nodded. A simple gesture, but it said everything. You belong here. You are seen. You are valued. Terrence's gaze moved on, past the older couple in the booth, both on their feet clapping, past the regulars at the bar, past the young performers who'd played earlier, all standing in awe. And then his eyes found Brandon's table. The 4 young men were standing too. Trevor was awake now, swaying but upright. Dylan still had his phone out, but had stopped recording to clap. Connor was crying, not even trying to hide it. And Brandon. Brandon stood with his hands clasped together, not clapping, but pressed against his chest. Tears streaming down his face, his expression one of complete and utter devastation. When Terrence's eyes met Brandon's, the young man visibly flinched, as if that gaze, calm and tired and infinitely kind, despite everything, was too much to bear. The applause began to die down. People sat. But the energy in the room had completely changed. The Rusty Anchor, which 30 minutes ago had been just another bar with just another open mic night, now felt sacred, like a place where something important had happened, where lives had been changed. Marie stepped up to the microphone. Her voice was thick with emotion. "Terrence Walker." "Everyone." More applause. She waited for it to quiet. I think that's going to be a tough act to follow. So let's take a short break, 15 minutes, and then we'll continue." She paused. "Terrence, honey, anything you want is on the house tonight. Anything. Forever." Laughter. Warm. Appreciative. People started moving, talking. Several approached Terrence where he still stood by the piano, offering thanks, asking questions. Where did he study? How long had he been playing? Would he come back next week? Terrence answered quietly, politely. Yes, he'd studied at Juilliard, a long time ago. No, he hadn't played in many years. He didn't know if he'd come back. He just wanted to play tonight. Just once. An older woman pressed a $20 bill into his hand. "For your music," she said. He tried to refuse. She insisted. "Please." It was worth so much more than this. A middle-aged man offered his card. "I volunteer with Veteran Services. If you need help with housing, medical care, anything, please call. Please." Terrence took the card, nodded. "Thank you." More people, more offers, more kindness. Overwhelming. Beautiful. Almost too much. And then through the small crowd, Brandon approached. The conversations around them died down as people noticed, stepped back, gave space. Brandon stood in front of Terrence, the homeless veteran 67 years old, weathered by life, and the college senior 22, privileged and broken by shame. Brandon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His hands were shaking. "Sir, His voice cracked. He tried again. "Sir, I'm so sorry." Terrence looked at him, really looked at him, saw a young man who'd made mistakes, said cruel things, but who was also standing here now apologizing. That took courage. Not much, perhaps, but some. "I was wrong," Brandon continued. "I was cruel and ignorant and wrong. I have no excuse. I'm so sorry." The tears were falling again. "I had no idea. No one has I've never heard anyone play like that. And I mocked you. I'm so ashamed." The bar was silent again, everyone watching this moment, waiting to see how Terrence would respond. Terrence studied Brandon for a long moment. Then slowly he reached out and put a hand on the young man's shoulder. His voice when he spoke was gentle, kind, tired, but not unkind. "We all make mistakes, son. Every one of us. I've made plenty, more than you can imagine." He paused. "What matters isn't what you did. It's what you do next. Learn from this. Be better. That's all any of us can do." Brandon's face crumpled. He nodded, unable to speak. "Where," Brandon managed after a moment. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Juilliard. Terrence said simply. "A lifetime ago." "Why?" Brandon stopped himself, realized that question was too personal, too invasive. But Terrence answered it anyway. "Life happened, son. War. Trauma. Bad luck. Bad choices. Take your pick. But tonight," he looked back at the piano. "Tonight I got to remember who I was. And that's enough." Brandon nodded, wiped his eyes. "Thank you for playing. And thank you for not hating me." Terrence smiled just slightly. "Takes too much energy to hate. Don't have enough left for that." Brandon laughed despite himself. A broken wet sound. Can I buy you dinner? Please, it's the least I can do." Terrence considered. He was hungry, always hungry, but accepting charity had never come easy. Marie called from the bar. "Terrence, I've got a burger and fries coming up for you. Best thing on the menu. And it's not charity, it's payment for the performance." Terrence looked at her, nodded. "Thank you, Marie." Brandon stepped back. His friends joined him. Connor approached next, voice shaking. "Sir, I'm sorry too. I was awful. I'm so sorry." "Dylan, we all are. What you did tonight, what you played, I'll never forget it." Even Trevor, sobering up enough to understand what had happened, mumbled an apology. Terrence accepted them all with the same grace, the same quiet dignity. Then he moved to a booth near the piano, sat down, and Marie brought him food. He ate slowly, savoring it. The bar gradually returned to normal around him, though the energy remained different, charged, special. Brandon and his friends moved to a table in the corner, quiet now, reflective. No more jokes, no more cruelty. Just 4 young men confronting the fact that their assumptions about the world had been fundamentally challenged. At 8:30, Marie got back on the mic. "All right, folks, let's continue. Next up, we have David playing guitar." The open mic went on. People performed. But nothing could match what had come before. Everyone knew it. But they tried anyway. Did their best. And the crowd was warm, supportive, appreciative. Terrence stayed through it all, listening. Sometimes his eyes would drift closed. Sometimes he'd watch the performers. Occasionally his hands would move slightly, fingers twitching, remembering. At 10 o'clock, the open mic ended. People began to leave. Several stopped by Terrence's booth to say goodbye, to thank him again, to press money or cards or offers of help into his hand. Brandon approached one final time before leaving. "Sir, I know I already apologized, but I need you to know. I'm going to be better. I'm going to remember tonight, remember you, and I'm going to do better." Terrence nodded. "That's all anyone can ask. Will you be here next week?" "I don't know, son. I don't know." Brandon nodded, started to leave, turned back. "I hope you will be." After everyone had left, Terrence remained. Marie was cleaning up, closing down. She approached his booth with another glass of water, sat down across from him. "You need a place to stay tonight?" she asked. "I'll be all right." "Terrence, I'm not asking. I'm offering. I've got a couch. It's not much, but it's warm and it's safe." He looked at her. This woman who'd shown him nothing but kindness. "Why? Because tonight you reminded me why I do this. Why I keep this open mic going. Because you never know who's going to walk through that door. Never know whose story you're going to hear. And because you deserve better than the streets tonight." "So, what do you say?" Terrence felt something break inside him. A wall he'd built over 30 years. Tears came to his eyes. "Okay," he whispered. "Thank you. Don't mention it." Marie stood. "Let me finish closing up. Then we'll go." An hour later, Terrence lay on Marie's couch in her apartment above the bar. A real roof over his head. A blanket. A pillow. Safe. Warm. He stared at the ceiling in the darkness. His hands still remembered. The music still flowed. For the first time in 3 decades, he let himself wonder maybe there was a way back. Maybe not to what he'd been before, but to something. To a life that included music again. Maybe. Just maybe. He closed his eyes and slept without nightmares for the first time in longer than he could remember. Tuesday nights at the Rusty Anchor would never be the same. Word spread. Of course it did. In the age of social media, Dylan's recording was online within hours. By morning, it had a few thousand views. By the end of the week, a few 100,000. News outlets picked it up. Homeless veteran's piano performance goes viral. Forgotten Juilliard graduate stuns bar crowd. The man who lost everything but his talent. Terrence didn't know about any of that at first. He stayed with Marie for a few days. She helped him connect with veteran services, got him into a program. They found him temporary housing, helped him apply for benefits he'd never thought to seek, connected him with mental health services specifically for veterans with PTSD. It wasn't a miracle cure. The trauma didn't vanish. The nightmares didn't stop completely. But there was support now. Structure. People who understood. And there was music. The following Tuesday, Terrence came back to the Rusty Anchor. Marie had saved him a spot on the sign-up sheet. When he walked in, the bar erupted in applause. People had come specifically to see if he'd return. The place was packed. He played again. Schubert this time, then some Debussy, then, because someone requested it, the Moonlight Sonata again. Brandon was there, in the front, sitting quietly listening. Connor and Dylan too. Trevor hadn't come. He'd been too ashamed. But the others had. After Terrence finished playing, Brandon approached again. Mr. Walker, I did some research this week about Juilliard, about piano performance. I had no idea how much work goes into what you do, how many hours, how much dedication. Terrence smiled slightly. Most people don't. I also looked into veteran services. I want to help. Is there an organization you'd recommend, where I could volunteer? Terrence told him about the program that had helped him. Brandon wrote down the information. I'm going there this weekend. I'm going to sign up. Connor and Dylan too. That's good, Terrence said. Those programs need help. I know it doesn't make up for what I said, what I did. But I need to do something. I need to be better. Then be better son. That's all there is to it. Brandon nodded, started to leave, turned back. Mr. Walker, would you ever consider teaching piano, I mean? I don't have any talent, but I'd like to learn. I'd like to understand it better. Terrence considered. He'd never taught before, but he remembered what Claire had said decades ago. You'll be a great teacher. You have patience, and you understand what it's like to struggle. I could try, he said finally. I'd need an instrument and a space. I'll figure that out, Brandon said quickly. I'll find a place. Get a piano, whatever you need. Over the next few months, Brandon kept his word. He rented a small studio space, found a used upright piano, decent quality, paid for tuning, set up a simple teaching space. Terrence started teaching. Just a few students at first. Brandon, who had no natural talent, but worked harder than anyone. A young girl from the neighborhood whose parents couldn't afford lessons. An older man who'd always wanted to learn. Word spread about that too. More students came. Terrence never charged much, enough to help cover his expenses now that he had an apartment through the VA program. But he wasn't doing it for money. He was doing it for the same reason Mr. Christopher Yates had taught him all those years ago. Because talent and passion deserved nurturing. Because music mattered. Because everyone deserved a chance. Marie continued hosting open mic nights. Terrence became a regular performer. Sometimes he'd play solo. Sometimes he'd accompany singers. Sometimes he'd just sit and listen to others offering encouragement and advice. The Rusty Anchor became known for it. People came from across Chicago to hear him play, to experience the magic of watching someone who'd lost everything find themselves again through music. News outlets did stories. Local first, then national. Terrence gave a few interviews, told his story. The Juilliard years, the military service, the PTSD, the homelessness, the long years of loss. But he always emphasized he wasn't special. There were thousands of veterans like him, tens of thousands, people who'd served and come back broken, who'd lost jobs, lost families, lost homes, who slipped through the cracks of a system that didn't know how to help them. I'm just lucky, he'd say. Lucky I walked into that bar. Lucky Marie was kind. Lucky someone recorded it. Most people like me don't get lucky. We just disappear. His interviews raised awareness. Donations to veteran services increased. Volunteers signed up. It was a small impact in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. Brandon graduated from Northwestern, turned down a job at his father's dealership. Instead, he went to work for a nonprofit that helped homeless veterans. Connor joined him. Dylan went to law school, but volunteered on weekends. Even Trevor eventually came around, too embarrassed to face Terrence directly, but quietly donating money to veteran programs. A year after that first Tuesday night, a classical music blogger reached out to Terrence, asked if he'd ever consider performing publicly again. A real concert, a recital. Terrence's first instinct was to say no. Too much pressure, too many memories of what he'd lost. But Marie convinced him. You've got the gift back, Terrence. Share it. Not for you, for all those people who need to hear it. So he agreed. Small venue. A community arts center. Tickets were free. All donations went to veteran mental health services. The night of the recital, Terrence stood backstage, terrified. His hands shook. The old fears crept in. What if he failed? What if the trauma came back mid-performance? What if he froze? Brandon was there, helping backstage. Saw Terrence's fear. Mr. Walker, you've got this. You've already done the hard part. You've already come back. This is just sharing what you found. Terrence nodded, took a deep breath, walked onto the stage. The hall was packed, every seat filled, people standing in the back. Marie was in the front row, Brandon and his friends nearby, his students scattered throughout, people from the Rusty Anchor, veterans from the support group he'd joined, strangers who'd seen the videos and wanted to witness this in person. Terrence sat at the piano, a beautiful Steinway Grand donated for the evening. He adjusted the bench, positioned his hands, and he began to play. Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the piece he'd played that first night, but this time in a proper concert hall on a magnificent instrument with no distractions. Just the music, it was transcendent. Every note perfect. Every phrase shaped with the wisdom of someone who'd lived a full, painful, beautiful life. The music spoke of loss and hope, of falling and rising, of the human capacity to survive and against all odds to create beauty, even from suffering. The audience sat mesmerized. This wasn't just a performance. This was testimony. Proof that talent doesn't die. That the human spirit, no matter how battered, can find its way back. When the final chord faded, there was silence. That profound silence that follows something important. Then eruption, standing ovation, cheers, tears, applause that went on for 5 full minutes. Terrence stood, bowed, looked out at the faces, saw acceptance, appreciation, love, and he realized something. He'd spent 30 years thinking he'd lost everything. His career, his dreams, his identity. And in a sense he had. But he'd found something too. Resilience, humility, empathy, understanding. The knowledge that dignity doesn't come from success or status. It comes from within, from how you treat others, from the courage to keep going even when everything seems lost. and he'd found his way back to music. Not as the prodigy he'd been, not as the concert pianist he'd dreamed of becoming, but as something else. A teacher, an inspiration, a living reminder that it's never too late, that redemption is possible, that second chances exist if you're brave enough to take them. After the recital, people lined up to meet him, thank him, share their own stories of loss and recovery. Veterans who'd struggled, musicians who'd given up and felt inspired to try again. Young people who'd never understood the value of perseverance until they'd heard his story. Brandon approached, tears in his eyes again. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on me, on any of us, for showing us what matters." Terrence put a hand on his shoulder, the same gesture he'd made a year ago in the bar. "You did the work, son. You changed. That's all on you. You gave me the reason to change. No, I gave you the opportunity to see what you needed to see. You chose to learn from it." "Not everyone does." Marie hugged him afterward. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "Couldn't have done it without you," Terrence replied. "You saw me, when no one else did. You saw me, I just gave you a platform. You did the rest." Over the next few years, Terrence performed occasionally. Always small venues, always for charity, always with the goal of raising awareness about veteran issues, about mental health, about the importance of supporting those who'd served. But mostly he taught, built up a studio of students, some talented, some not. Didn't matter to him. He gave each the same attention and care that Mr. Yates had given him all those years ago. He stayed in touch with Brandon, who'd become like a son to him. The young man had transformed completely. No more arrogance, no more entitlement. He worked hard at the non-profit, genuinely trying to make a difference. Eventually married, named his first son Christopher Terrence after the two men who'd taught him what dignity and compassion looked like. The Rusty Anchor remained Terrence's home base. Every Tuesday, if he wasn't performing elsewhere, he'd be there, playing a few pieces, listening to others. Marie always had his drink ready, water, sometimes coffee, never alcohol. He'd been sober since that first night, didn't need it anymore, had something better, had purpose. On the 10-year anniversary of that first Tuesday night, the Rusty Anchor threw a celebration. Packed house. People from all over Chicago. Some who'd been there that original night. Many who'd only heard the story. Marie gave a speech. Talked about how one night had changed her bar, changed her life. How witnessing true grace and talent in the most unexpected place had reminded her why she did what she did. Brandon spoke too. Talked about being a stupid, privileged kid who'd learned the most important lesson of his life from a man he'd mocked. How that lesson had shaped everything that came after. Students shared stories about how Terrence had taught them more than piano, had taught them persistence, patience, the value of practice, the beauty of dedication. And then Terrence played. One final time at the Rusty Anchor. He chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G major, a piece he'd played for his farewell recital at Juilliard all those years ago, before the military, before the trauma, before the loss. But this time he played it differently, not with the virtuosity of youth, but with the wisdom of age, with the understanding that comes from having survived, from having lost everything and found a way back. When he finished, the bar erupted in applause one more time. But Terrence didn't stand immediately. He sat at the piano, hands resting on the keys, and thought about the journey, from a 7-year-old boy hearing music for the first time, to a young man at Juilliard with the world ahead of him. to a soldier experiencing horror, to a broken veteran on the streets, to this moment. Full circle, but different. Better in some ways, because he understood now what he hadn't understood at 23. That talent wasn't enough, that success wasn't the goal, that what mattered was connection, service, using whatever gifts you had to make the world slightly better, to help others, to create beauty not for its own sake, but as a gift to those who needed it. He stood, turned to the crowd, bowed, and smiled. Because he'd found his way home, not to the dream he'd had at 23, but to something real, something sustainable, something that mattered. The story of Terrence Walker didn't end with triumph and applause. Real life rarely works that way, but it did end with something more valuable: peace. 10 years after that first Tuesday night at the Rusty Anchor, Terrence was 77 years old. Still teaching, still playing occasionally, living in a small apartment on the south side not far from where he'd grown up. Not wealthy, not famous beyond his small circle, but content. His studio had become a fixture in the neighborhood. Kids from families who couldn't afford traditional lessons came to him. He charged what they could pay, sometimes nothing. The nonprofit Brandon worked for helped supplement his income when needed. He got by. His students won competitions occasionally. Some went on to study music in college. One even got accepted to Juilliard. Terrence cried when he heard, attended the young woman's first recital there, saw himself in her dedication, her talent, her hunger to be better. The PTSD never completely went away. There were still hard days. Days when the memories were too much, when the nightmares came back. But he had support now. Therapy, friends, a community. He'd learned to manage it, to live with it. It didn't define him anymore. Marie was still running the Rusty Anchor, though she'd slowed down a bit. Hired help, talking about retirement but never quite doing it. Open mic. Tuesdays continued. Terrence still came when he could, still played. Brandon was 42 now, running the nonprofit he'd started. Married with 3 kids, he brought them to Terrence's studio sometimes, wanted them to learn from the man who'd changed his life, to understand that wisdom and dignity could come from unexpected places. Connor had become a therapist, specializing in veteran PTSD, directly inspired by watching Terrence's journey. Dylan practiced veteran advocacy law, often pro bono. Trevor had eventually faced Terrence, apologized properly, and now donated substantial amounts to veteran causes every year. The viral video from that first night was still online, millions of views by now. Comments from people all over the world, stories of their own redemptions, their own second chances, their own moments of recognizing they'd been wrong about someone. But Terrence rarely watched it, didn't need to. He'd lived it. What mattered wasn't the performance itself. It was what came after. The slow rebuilding. The daily choice to keep going. The small moments of connection with students. The quiet satisfaction of helping someone else find their voice through music. On a Tuesday evening in late November, Terrence sat in his small apartment preparing for a lesson. His next student, a 9-year-old boy named Marcus, was coming. The boy was struggling with a Haydn sonatina, getting frustrated, wanting to give up. Terrence planned to tell him a story about a 7-year-old boy who could barely reach the pedals, about a teacher who believed in him when no one else did, about how talent mattered less than persistence, less than showing up, less than trying again even when it seemed hopeless. He'd tell Marcus about failure too, about losing everything, because that was part of the story, part of every story. Life breaks everyone. The question isn't whether you'll face hardship, it's what you do afterward. There was a knock at the door, Marcus eager despite his frustration. Terrence smiled and let him in. They worked on the Haydn piece, broke it down, note by note, phrase by phrase. When Marcus got frustrated, Terrence told him to pause. Play something you love, something easy. Remind yourself why you're doing this. Marcus played a simple melody he'd learned months ago. His face relaxed. The joy came back. That's the secret, Terrence said softly. Never forget the joy. The technique matters. The practice matters. But if you lose the joy, you lose everything. No matter how good you get if there's no joy. What's the point? Marcus nodded. Understood at least a little. After the lesson, after Marcus left, Terrence sat at his own piano. An upright, not fancy. But it was his. He played quietly. No audience, no performance. Just him and the music. He played the same piece he'd played that first night. The Moonlight Sonata. But softer this time. Gentler. Because he wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Wasn't trying to reclaim anything. He was just playing because he loved it. Because it brought him peace. As his fingers moved across the keys, he thought about Mr. Yates. About his mother and father. About Claire, whom he'd never spoken to again but wished well. About all the people who'd been part of his journey. And he thought about that Tuesday night 10 years ago. The night he'd walked into the Rusty Anchor with nothing. No home. No hope. Just a desperate desire to touch a piano one more time. That one decision, that one moment of courage, had changed everything. Not in the dramatic way movies portray. He hadn't become rich or famous, hadn't reclaimed his former glory, hadn't gotten everything back, but he'd found something better. Purpose. Community. The chance to pass on what he'd learned. The opportunity to help others the way he'd been helped. And he'd proven something to himself. That he was more than his worst moments, more than his trauma, more than his failures. He was Terrence Walker, student of Christopher Yates, graduate of Juilliard, veteran, survivor, teacher, pianist, human, flawed and broken and beautiful, like everyone else, like the students he taught, like the young men who'd mocked him and learned from it, like Marie, who'd offered kindness when he needed it most, like every person who'd ever struggled and kept going anyway. The piece ended. He sat in the quiet of his apartment, hands resting on the keys, peaceful. Outside, Chicago moved on. Cars passed. People lived their lives. The world turned indifferent to individual stories of loss and redemption. But inside this small apartment, there was music. There was meaning. There was proof that it's never too late, that second chances exist, that one moment of courage, one decision to try again, can change everything. Not in the ways you expect, not in the ways you plan, but in the ways that matter. Terrence closed the piano, made himself tea, sat by the window watching the street below. Tomorrow he'd teach more lessons. Friday he'd play at the Rusty Anchor. Next week would bring whatever it brought. He was ready for it. Finally. After so many years of just surviving, he was living again. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Sometimes the most profound stories aren't about people who achieve greatness. They're about people who lose everything and find a way to keep going. Who fall as far as a person can fall and still choose one day to stand back up. Terrence Walker's story isn't unique. There are thousands like it. Veterans who came home broken. Artists who lost their calling. People who slipped through the cracks of a system that didn't know how to catch them. Most of those stories don't have happy endings. Most don't get viral videos or second chances or redemption arcs. But some do. And those stories matter because they remind us that dignity exists in unexpected places. That talent and worth aren't dependent on circumstances. That the person you dismiss might be extraordinary. That kindness costs nothing but can change everything. And they remind us that it's never too late. Never too late to try again. To forgive. To be better. To find your way back to who you were meant to be. Terrence Walker walked into a bar on a Tuesday night with nothing but worn clothes and weathered hands. He walked out with hope. That's the real story. Not the performance, not the applause. The hope. Because hope is what allows us to survive, to endure, to try one more time even when it seems pointless. Hope is the first note of every song, the beginning of every journey back. And sometimes all it takes is one person who sees you, one moment of courage, one chance to prove to yourself that you're still in there, still capable, still worthy. One Tuesday night at a bar called the Rusty Anchor, where everyone gets a turn, where dignity matters, where music can save a life, and where, if you're very lucky, you might remember who you were before the world tried to tell you otherwise.